In 1972, a woman named Helena gave birth to a daughter in a small apartment in Warsaw. She did not cry during labor. She did not cry afterward. She had not cried in 27 years, not since the winter she was 12 years old, and something happened in her village that she never spoke about to anyone, not to her husband, not to her sister, not to any priest or doctor or friend who ever asked. She had simply decided, somewhere in the silent machinery of herself, that crying was a door she could not afford to open. So she closed it, and she handed her daughter forward into a world that looked nothing like the one she had survived. The daughter's name was Anna. Anna grew up in a quiet home. No violence, no visible poverty. A father who worked, a mother who cooked, school, summers, ordinary life by any external measurement. But Anna could never sleep through the night. She could not explain why. She had tried in her 30s, sitting across from a therapist who asked her to trace the anxiety back to its source. And she kept arriving at nothing. No event, no wound she could name. The dread was just there, structural, load-bearing, older than any memory she had access to. When Anna was 41, she had a daughter of her own. She named her Marta. And Marta, growing up in an apartment in a city her great-grandmother could not have imagined, with a phone in her pocket and food in the refrigerator and no war within 1,000 miles of her life, could not sleep through the night either. She carried a hypervigilance so precise it embarrassed her, a readiness for loss that arrived before there was any evidence of loss coming, a grief sourceless and insistent, but that she had never been able to explain to anyone who hadn't felt it themselves. Marta had not lived through anything that should have produced what she felt, but her great-grandmother had, and the body does not forget, not in the way the mind forgets, not with the mercy of time and distance and new context. The body keeps a different kind of record, one written not in memory, but in chemistry, not in language, but in the molecular architecture of how a nervous system is built, calibrated, and handed forward generation by generation, like a set of instructions for a world that no longer exists. There is a fear you carry that has no memory attached to it, not anxiety about something that happened, not dread you can trace to a specific room, a specific voice, a specific moment when the floor shifted under you. This fear is older than your memories. It lives in your body the way a scar lives in skin that never broke. Invisible evidence of a wound you did not receive. You have felt it. The tightening before nothing in particular, the hypervigilance in rooms where nothing is wrong, the grief that arrives without cause, so clean and so total, it almost feels like it belongs to someone else. It does. What Rachel Yehuda found in 1994 was not a psychological curiosity. It was evidence that should have broken something open in how we understand suffering, inheritance, and the stories we tell ourselves about why we are the way we are. She studied the children of Holocaust survivors, not the survivors themselves. Their children asked people who had never seen a cattle car or heard the sound of a door being locked from the outside or felt what it means to have your name replaced with a number burned into your arm. These were people who had grown up in Queens and Brooklyn, in apartments that smelled like coffee and old furniture, ordinary lives. And their cortisol levels were altered, not in the way trauma survivors show altered cortisol, in the way their parents did, the same biological signature. The same stress response chemistry of a terror they had never lived through, sitting in their blood like a dispatch from a war that ended before they were born. Her team then went further and identified specific methylation changes in the FKBP5 gene in both the survivors and their children simultaneously. The FKBP5 gene is not peripheral. It governs glucocorticoid receptor sensitivity, which determines how intensely your body responds to cortisol, how high the stress response climbs, and how slowly it descends after the threat has passed. The same alteration, the same gene, across a generation that shared no experiential history of the original event. Miriam, sitting in that research office in New York in 1994, was not suffering from memory. She was suffering from biology, from a stress response system that had been calibrated before she was born to the frequency of a danger she had never touched. And she had spent 43 years constructing explanations for it using the only material she had access to: her own life, her own choices, her own autobiography, selecting experiences that seemed to justify what her body was already signaling. That selection was not wrong. It was incomplete. Your DNA is not a fixed document. This needs to be said clearly, because most people absorb the opposite assumption without ever being taught it directly. The idea that your genes are your blueprint, static, settled, written in stone the moment two cells found each other and began dividing into you. The truth is older and stranger and far less comfortable than that. Your genome is more like a manuscript that has been marked up across generations, annotated in the margins by every hand that held it before yours. The letters themselves may not change. The actual sequence of base pairs that constitute your genetic code is largely stable. But which letters get read, which genes are expressed and which are silenced, which biological instructions are activated and which are suppressed, that is governed by a separate layer of chemical markings that sit directly on top of the DNA. These are called epigenetic tags, and unlike the genome itself, they are not static. They respond. They change in response to environment, to sustained stress, to the presence or absence of safety, to famine, to violence, to the slow accumulation of a world that cannot be trusted. And they are heritable. Epigenetic methylation, the addition of methyl groups to specific sites in the DNA strand, does not require you to experience anything. It requires only that someone before you did. The marks left by their experience can pass through the germline, through eggs and sperm, into the cellular architecture of a body being built years or decades later in an entirely different world. And carrying biological instructions calibrated for a reality that is already gone. Your nervous system is not overreacting. Say that to yourself and actually let it land. It is accurately responding to a threat it inherited the memory of. Not your memory, not your experience. The molecular residue of an experience that preceded you, written into the chemistry of how your body builds itself and runs itself and registers the presence of danger. The response is correct. The threat is just no longer there. That is not a comfort. It is a much harder thing. Because if your fear is accurate to a world that no longer exists, the question becomes, what do you do with a nervous system tuned to frequencies that nothing in your current life is broadcasting? And the answer, if you follow it honestly, is that you have been doing what every generation before you did. Finding evidence, constructing situations that justify the signal, not deliberately, not consciously. But the nervous system seeks coherence. It cannot tolerate a feeling without a story. And if the feeling is inherited readiness for catastrophe, you will find over and over material in your own life that seems to confirm it. You will interpret ambiguous signals as hostile. You will feel the approach of loss before there is any evidence of it coming. You will be in ways that exhaust you and confuse the people who love you, always slightly braced. And you will call that your psychology, your patterns, your wounds. It is all of those things. It is also older than all of those things. Michael Meaney at McGill spent years watching rats. Specifically, what happened in the first week of a rat pup's life, depending on how much grooming its mother provided. Consistent, attentive grooming versus the distracted or absent care of a mother under stress. The difference between the two groups was not behavioral in any surface sense. It was molecular. The methylation patterns on the glucocorticoid receptor gene, the same class of regulatory gene at the center of Yehuda's research, were measurably different between pups who received consistent maternal contact and those who did not. Pups who were groomed regularly expressed more glucocorticoid receptors. Their stress response activated appropriately and then came down. Cortisol spiked when it should and receded when the threat passed. The system regulated. Pups who had received inconsistency showed fewer receptors expressed. Their stress responses ran hotter, lasted longer. The cortisol spiked higher and decayed more slowly long after the stressor was gone. They were more reactive to identical stimuli, more difficult to soothe, more prone to what looked, from the outside, like anxiety. When those pups became mothers, their pups showed the same pattern. Not because anyone had traumatized them directly, not because they had observed or learned anything, because the epigenetic instruction had propagated forward through the body of the mother into the body of the next generation, silently, automatically, without any narrative attached. No abuse on the record, no identifiable violent event. Just the absence of something. The repeated signal of safety that never arrived consistently enough to be metabolized as reliable. And that absence, that particular shape of unreliability, wrote itself into the genome like a standing instruction for futures that hadn't arrived yet. Think about what you were not given, not what was done to you, what was withheld. The attunement that came sometimes but not consistently, which is neurologically, not metaphorically, but neurologically, more destabilizing than no attunement at all. Intermittent reinforcement activates the same dopaminergic and threat response circuits as unpredictable danger. The nervous system cannot distinguish between a reward that might arrive and a threat that might arrive. The uncertainty itself is the injury, and the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system that governs your entire stress architecture, was calibrated in that gap, in the space between what your nervous system needed to feel safe and what actually reliably arrived. And that calibration was not your starting point. It arrived with instructions already written, from a body that came before yours, from a gap that belonged to someone else. In a small Swedish parish called Överkalix, meticulous records were kept across centuries: birth years, death ages, harvest yields, famine winters, the kind of obsessively maintained historical documentation that accumulates in cold places where survival required counting. In the 1980s, Lars Olov Bygren began working through these records with a question so simple it should not have produced the results it did. Does what your grandfather ate during a single critical window of his childhood affect how long you live? The answer arrived with a precision that had no comfortable explanation. Boys who experienced a feast year during the slow growth period just before puberty, a window of intense cellular reorganization and rapid biological change, had grandsons who died significantly earlier. The body, having registered abundance during that sensitive period, had adjusted its metabolic programming accordingly, set it for a world of plenty, and that setting propagated forward. Boys who experienced famine during that same window had grandsons who lived longer. The body had calibrated for scarcity and built for endurance, and the instruction held across 3 generations through grandchildren who had never known winter in the same way, who lived in a world unrecognizable from the one that had shaped the original signal. 3 generations through nothing but harvest records and church death registries. The body of a child in a Swedish winter in 1890 was leaving molecular instructions for a body that would not exist for another 60 years and would never know what that winter felt like. Your relationship with scarcity carries the handwriting of people you may never have met. Not only material scarcity, though that too, the scarcity of consistent love, the scarcity of a calm adult in a room where calm was needed, the scarcity of words that name things accurately, of someone who could sit with your distress without flinching or vanishing or turning it back into something about themselves. That specific quality of lack, repeated, registers in developing biology the way famine registers in a growing body, as information, as instruction, as a standing directive for the organism that comes next. You have been spending years trying to understand yourself using only the material of your own life, only your own memories, only the events and relationships and moments you can actually access. And that excavation is not wrong, but it has a floor, and beneath that floor is another story, one that belongs to someone else, that you inherited without being told you were carrying it, without being given the context that would have let you understand what it was and where it came from. Vincent Felitti's Adverse Childhood Experiences study, run through Kaiser Permanente in the 1990s, documented something that the medical establishment resisted for years. That adverse childhood experiences, the presence of chronic stress, emotional unavailability, addiction, violence, or sustained instability in a child's early environment correlated with adult health outcomes in a dose-response relationship. Not just psychological outcomes, physical ones, cardiovascular disease, autoimmune disorders, cancer incidents, chronic pain that had no identifiable structural origin. The dose-response relationship means that the more A, C, E's a person accumulated, the worse the health outcomes in a clean, terrible linearity. Not random, not mediated by choice or behavior in any simple sense, correlated directly with the early environment's capacity to produce or withhold safety. But the finding that receives the least attention is the one that matters most here. Many of the adults presenting with these outcomes had no conscious access to the adversity as adversity. They had explanations, frameworks, narratives in which what happened was normal, was manageable, was something they had long since processed and moved past. Their bodies told a different story, and in many cases, their children's bodies were beginning to tell the same one. Not because the same events had occurred, because the biology shaped by those events had propagated forward through the same mechanism Yehuda was documenting in Holocaust survivors. Through chemistry, through epigenetic instruction, through the germline, the wound does not announce its origin. It arrives as a state, a posture, a quality of alertness that has no narrative source because it predates the capacity for narrative. Dan Siegel's work on implicit memory makes this visible at the level of neuroscience. Explicit memory gives you a story, dates, faces, a sequence of events you can recall and arrange into something that makes sense. Implicit memory gives you a state, a sensation, a reflexive contraction in the chest before the mind has had time to process what triggered it. A quality of knowing that lives below language, encoded before the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, were sufficiently developed to store experience as narrative. This means there is a category of early experience that shapes you without giving you access to it. You cannot remember it because it was never stored in a form that memory can retrieve. But it is present in the way you hold tension in your shoulders in certain kinds of rooms, in the speed with which you scan a face for signs of disapproval before the person has even finished speaking, in the particular quality of silence that makes you feel unsafe in a way you cannot explain to anyone who has never felt it. Now extend that back a generation. 2, 3. The implicit memory of an ancestor's sustained terror encoded in epigenetic markings passed through the germline, arriving in your biology before you had a name, before you had a nervous system that could interpret what it was receiving, not as a story, not as a feeling you can identify and trace, as a set of biological instructions already in place when your nervous system began building itself, calibrating itself, deciding on the basis of chemistry rather than experience what kind of world it was being built for. And the world it was built for no longer exists. What you have been calling your psychology, your patterns, your issues, your recurring themes, or your inability to trust or rest or believe that safety is real and will last, some significant portion of that may not have originated with you at all. It may have been waiting for you, written in advance, addressed to a body that had not yet arrived. The most unsettling thing about this is not the inheritance itself. It is what it means for the explanations you have constructed, for the self-knowledge you have accumulated, for the years spent in conversation with yourself or a therapist or a journal, tracing the arc from cause to effect, identifying the people and moments that shaped you, building a map of your own interior that you have been using as the primary tool for understanding why you are the way you are. That map is not wrong. It is just missing a continent. There is a history you were never told that is nonetheless running in you right now. In the way your cortisol responds, in the way your attachment system evaluates threat, in the readiness for loss that arrives before there is any evidence of it, in the 3 a.m. waking that has no identifiable trigger. You have been writing explanations for these experiences using your autobiography as the only available text, and the autobiography accounts for some of it. But some of it was already there when you arrived, pre-written, in a language older than memory. Bruce Lipton's work in cellular biology demonstrated that cells are not simply executed by their genetic instructions. They respond to their environment continuously. The cell membrane functions as a receiver, translating signals from the organism's environment into adjustments in genetic expression. The genome is not a dictator. It is a responder. It reads context and adjusts accordingly, and in the process of responding, it leaves marks, chemical notes about the nature of the world that shaped it, and those notes can be passed forward. You are not separate from your environment. You never were. Your great-grandmother was not separate from hers. The winter she survived, the particular quality of danger or grief or prolonged uncertainty that reshaped her stress architecture, that experience had molecular consequences. They propagated forward through a mechanism that operated entirely below the threshold of conscious experience or deliberate choice. She did not decide to transmit it. She could not have chosen not to, and neither could anyone in the chain between her and you. Guilt does not survive contact with this information, not honest guilt, because guilt requires that you could have chosen otherwise, and what you are carrying, the hypervigilance, the dysregulation, the grief without an object, the ancient readiness for catastrophe, was in significant part determined before you had the capacity to determine anything. You have been applying personal moral categories to biological inheritance, and that category error has been expensive. In the years spent believing that if you had just responded differently, thought differently, been stronger or calmer or less reactive, you would not be the way you are. In the specific cruelty of shame directed at responses that were never primarily yours to begin with. In the exhaustion of trying to will yourself into a regulation your nervous system was not built for, because the building happened before you arrived. Somewhere in the chain of people who made you, something happened that no one talks about anymore. Maybe it was a war. Maybe it was a famine that lasted just long enough to write new instructions into a body that was still forming. Maybe it was a particular kind of poverty that left no visible marks but reshaped the nervous system of every child in that house. Maybe it was a grief so total that the only survivable response was to seal it completely, hand the children forward without explanation, and call the closure moving on. It moved on into the methylation patterns of a gene that the people involved had never heard named, also into the stress architecture of a nervous system being built in a womb decades later, into a calibration for a world that the person being built would never actually inhabit, into you. The question of whether this continues, whether the children you have or might have received the same epigenetic instructions, the same inherited frequency, the same ancient readiness for something that no longer exists, is not primarily answered by understanding. You can know everything documented here and remain biologically unchanged. Understanding is not the mechanism of revision. The mechanism is safety, prolonged, embodied, consistent experience of a nervous system that is allowed to regulate rather than activate. Real relationship, real environment. The slow molecular accumulation of evidence that the world does not match the inherited threat. That is what rewrites the instruction, not insight, not awareness. The actual felt experience of a different kind of world, sustained long enough to reach the cellular level and begin revising what was written there. Whether that is accessible to you depends on things you can influence and things that were decided before you had the capacity for decision. You are carrying someone else's emergency. The original emergency ended. The biological response to it never received the message. It has been faithfully signaling a danger that is no longer present in a language so old it predates your name, your memories, your understanding of yourself. Helena in Warsaw in 1945, closing the door she could not afford to open. Anna in her apartment, tracing the anxiety back to nothing, arriving repeatedly at a wound she could not find because it was not hers. Marta, with her phone and her full refrigerator and her inexplicable dread at 3 in the morning in a city her great-grandmother could not have imagined. And you, sitting with a feeling that has never had a name that fully fit, that you have explained to yourself 100 different ways and never quite believed any of them because none of them reached the bottom of it. This is the bottom of it. Not your choices, not your failures, not the people who hurt you, though they may have hurt you. Not even your own childhood, though it shaped you. Beneath all of that is a layer you did not put there, written in chemistry by people who had no idea they were writing anything at all, who were only surviving, only getting through, only doing what organisms do when the world becomes dangerous, which is adapt and transmit and hand the adaptation forward and call it living. They were doing what the body does, and the body handed it to you. The only chapter of this story that belongs entirely to you is the one you are living right now. The daily accumulation of safety or its absence, the quality of the nervous system you are building day by day in response to the environment you inhabit and the relationships you allow and the ways you learn, slowly and imperfectly, to let the threat signal rest when the threat is not there. That chapter matters, but even that is not written only by you. The inheritance is real. The fear is real. The wound existed. It just existed first in someone else's body, in a world that is gone, and arrived in yours without a return address, without an explanation, without anything except the sensation that you have always in some place beneath reason and memory and language been waiting for something terrible. You were not imagining it. You just inherited the waiting.